My name's Bruce Balmer from Total Fluency Limited. This is video 1 of 7 of the 7 steps we recommend people take before they start learning a foreign language. And the first thing to put in place is to choose your method. Now, there are lots of methods of learning language, but really they fall into 2 broad camps: self-directed learning or classroom learning. This is relevant because despite the declining popularity of classrooms, I would say that 40 to 50% of the people I talk to who mention they're going to learn a language follow that sentence almost immediately with, "and I've signed up for the classes." So it's still happening a lot of the time. In order to be as helpful as possible, I need to be as clear as possible and as direct as possible. So here it is. Unless you have a social agenda, I would recommend against signing up for language classes. And I consider this decision to be so important that it can be fateful for your program. Why? The challenge of learning a language is not really learning the language. Your mind is so constructed that it's almost impossible not to learn language when you're exposed to it. The key is it is a bigger job than most people expect, and you have to maintain your enthusiasm for a long enough period to reach a worthwhile point. And an economics teacher called Willie Moffat once spoke to this subject. We'd been chatting about education and life for about an hour, and Willie turned to me and said, "Bruce, you have an enthusiasm for learning that only the self-educated maintain." I think that's so important, let me repeat it. You have an enthusiasm for learning that only the self-educated maintain. Now, it would be unfair of me not to cover the positives of classrooms, so here they are. They create a good social environment, if that's your goal. They're easy to sign up for and broadly available. They provide a curriculum, structure, discipline, and assistance in learning the language. The key point is they're easy to sign up to, but for most people, they're hard to endure. And many people who quit on learning a language don't really quit on learning a language, they quit on the classroom experience. And the trouble with classrooms is it's not the teacher's fault, it's not the college's fault or the school's fault. They are structural problems, they're inherent to the classroom situation. As a society, we did not invent classrooms because they're a great idea. We invented them out of economic necessity. We could not afford to have one teacher for one pupil, so we put people together in groups. Let me just cover a few of the problems very briefly. Your teacher may be great or not so great. The speed, the pace of the class may be beyond your ability or beyond your comfort level or slower than you would prefer. The chances that it's just the right speed for you is actually quite low. And if you divide a class into, say, 3 groups, usually there's about a third that are bored because it's too slow, there's a third that are confused because it's too fast, and maybe a third who feel it's about the right pace. You may have an interest in a certain type of vocabulary or a certain type of language speaking, more formal, less formal, and so forth, and they may not be choosing the direction that really suits you. The implication is that we should all learn the same stuff in the same order, but that's just not true. The focus may not suit you. When I was between about the age of 12 and 14, somewhere in there, my dad came home and said, "Would you like to learn German with me?" Yes, any excuse to be with Dad. So we sat down and we started learning from a book called Hugo's German in 3 months. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that the implication of the title of that book is clearly that we will be able to speak German after 3 months. Actually, after 3 months, what we had was a tremendous and excessive knowledge of German grammar and a very, very small vocabulary, which meant you couldn't in any way hold a conversation that was interesting in German. And so really, that's not their fault. It's a great book in many ways, but we inferred that when they said German in 3 months, they didn't mean German grammar for 3 months. So sometimes a course has a focus. We wanted to focus on communication, they wanted to focus on grammar. One of the problems of a classroom is you can't, in the middle of a course, say, "Hey, how about we change this and do it differently?" The method being used is very, very probably the method that that teacher was taught when they were at school as a student. That method is antiquated and silly and should have been scrapped 30 years ago at the very least. But it is the predominant method in classrooms around the world. Now, the alternative to a classroom is self-study. And the first thing that's good about self-study is it fits with a fundamental truth. Neither I nor any other person can teach you a language. The only thing that happens is you learn language. And I can assist you in that process to some degree, but that is the limit of my powers. And so the first good thing about self-directed learning is it puts the emphasis where it should be. Your job is to acquire the language, not to wait to be given it. Now, pretty much everything that's bad about a classroom is good about self-directed learning, mostly because you have control over the situation. Let's look at some of the things you have control over. Well, firstly, the teacher. So if you're being overly harsh on yourself, since you're your teacher, then you can be kinder to yourself. If you're being too strict, you can be more relaxed. If you're being critical, you can be encouraging. Secondly, the speed. Not only can you pick the speed that's right for you, which depends on many factors, but you can actually vary it during the course. We work with a lot of people above a certain level in companies. Usually they prioritize their work, and those work demands and even family demands are going to change for them over a period of time. In a classroom, you can hardly say, oh, I would like to go at half the usual speed for 2 months. But in self-directed learning, you can choose exactly that when you need it. You can choose the focus. How much do you want to focus on communication? How much on grammar? The method. You can choose your method. You can experiment with different methods. You can even take parts that you like from different methods. Once you've got a tracking system in place and you can see the effect on your performance, you can try a more auditory approach, you can try a more written approach, you can try different times of day. You're free to become an expert language learner. Let's think about sequence for a second and remember that in order to maintain our enthusiasm, a language program should be rewarding, which means being able to speak about the things we find interesting. Now, I'm a very keen table tennis player, and so a part of my conversation is about table tennis, but that's a very specialized vocabulary, which I wouldn't even expect to be in the C2 degree level syllabus, but I'm going to want to talk about that stuff really early on. So by choosing self-directed learning, I can, without going completely crazy, add in areas of my personal interest so I can get talking to people and get listening to people as soon as possible. Given that classrooms have been going for decades and decades, and typically classes are around about 40 minutes to an hour, you might be forgiven for thinking that they've studied this and that is the right period that a person should learn for, the best length of time. It isn't, and this has been known for a long time now. 20 minutes is much better length of time. So why do schools typically use 40 to 60 minutes? And the answer is because that's the best combination of learning time and dealing with the logistical problem of moving humans about in an education environment. As a self-directed learner, you can get rid of the logistical problem and focus in on the best length of time to learn for you. My experience is that it's best to learn for somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes and then rest. But of course, as a self-directed learner, you're free to find whatever is the best length of time for you, which may be shorter or longer than the time I prefer. And finally, a little bit of control, the time of day. Obviously, if you're going to a classroom, you have to do that class when that class is on. Wouldn't be very successful if you went when the class wasn't on. But in a busy life, it's really useful to be able to control when you do your learning. Now, some people feel great first thing in the morning. I like to do my learning before any other stresses have occurred for the day. But back in my early 20s, when I was learning some German, I used to use my commuting time because otherwise it would be wasted. And so we can fit our learning around our schedule. We've also worked with a fireman not so long ago, and of course he needs a flexible schedule because his shifts keep rotating around. Enthusiasm is generated by return on investment, which in the case of language learning is progress over agony. Every time that you increase your rate of progress or you decrease the agony that you're suffering, you will increase your enthusiasm for the subject and thus your probability of reaching your goals. And self-directed learning allows for that. So do I recommend self-directed learning to people? Actually, no. If you can afford it, there's something even better. And this is assisted self-study, which is the crown jewels of learning method. It has all the positives of self-directed learning, plus you get a coach. The first job of your coach is to de-confuse you, because confusion is frustrating and impacts performance. And you'd be an unusual person indeed if you never got confused while learning a foreign language. Their second job is as a guide, and this is such an old principle. You find a local guide who's walked a certain route before, and they're able to say to you, don't go down that road because at the end of that road is a brick wall and you'll have to come all the way back again. For me, when I learned Thai, because that was my first Asian language and it was outside of my experience, I made some mistakes which ideally wish I could go back in time and not make. And that's the purpose of a guide, is to save you learning from your own experience when you can learn from someone else's experience. The third task is to focus your attention on those areas that will give you the greatest gain in performance in the shortest period of time. And their fourth task, if you want it, is to provide you with accountability so that each week you are doing your homework and making sure that you're making the rate of progress you were hoping to make. Now, with assisted self-directed learning, you have complete cost control. And people worry and say, well, surely the cost of a private tutor per hour is going to be far higher than the cost of a classroom per hour. Simple economics would suggest that would be true. And it is true, but it's the wrong question. The question is not, what is the cost per hour? The question is, what is the cost per percentage of reaching your goal? And because your progress as a self-directed learner with a coach, and especially if you're using accelerated language learning, will be far faster than a classroom, actually it can turn out to be a more economic solution. Two other things worth remembering is that if you're like our clients, time is money. And if you save a few hundred hours by not going through a classroom program, you should factor that into your total costs. And finally, one of the great things about assisted self-directed learning is if you're not getting on well with your teacher, and it's important that you do, if you're not doing that, you can change them anytime. Because if you're running the program, you don't have the problem of quitting one program and having to start again with somebody else, and those two programs don't dovetail very well. If you're able to use assisted self-directed learning, then there's a few things you should think about in choosing your coach. One, the more foreign languages that person speaks, probably on average, the better they will be at teaching you, because there's an increasing clarity comes from the process of learning a language, then another language, then another language. What truly matters between all of those different languages becomes clear. But if you decide not to learn a European language and you're learning an Asian language, make sure the person is experienced in that area. Two, preferably they would be self-educated as well. It's a slightly different skill and you want them to be experienced in the process that you're going to go through. Three, chemistry. You're going to be spending some time with them. You want to either like them or respect them, or preferably both. Four, hire them as a coach, but remember that you can always use them as a tutor. You can always say, I've no experience in this area, you tell me what to do. But keep that coaching relationship so that they're willing to flex with you and your program. So there you have it. My unequivocal recommendation is assisted self-directed learning if you can afford it. And the if you can afford it is interesting because if you compare the cost of that with the cost of classrooms per unit of progress, it's often a cheaper and vastly better solution, especially if you take into account fun and the probability of success. Because we're all in lockdown, I recommend it's a great moment to start. Get looking for a teacher. They're really easy to find. Type tutor into Google and you're off. There's no physical contact required, so you can maintain your social distance while learning a language. Now, I said that in order not to drift into the theoretical, I would relate everything to my own language learning program. So how am I going about learning my Italian? Well, it won't surprise you to know that I'm using assisted self-directed learning. My assistants include Google, some people to help me translate things where Google is not so good, conversation partners, a native speaker who's also a bit of a linguist, so I can ask him those slightly complicated questions that sometimes come up, and a curriculum builder. You don't have to build the curriculum yourself. Now, I'm very fortunate that the person building my curriculum is Chrissy Barton, my business partner in Total Fluency, and she is also an expert in accelerated learning. But even in the circumstance that she is building the curriculum, she is still taking requests from me so that we can personalize a few things and make sure that I'm having an enjoyable, satisfying experience where the progress I'm making is in areas that I find satisfying. So in summary, choose your method based on two things: money and that which is best going to provide you with enthusiasm and allow you to maintain that enthusiasm for a sufficient length of time to reach your goals, or at least a worthwhile point. And remember that whilst assisted self-directed learning may sound like it's going to be expensive, if you judge it per unit of progress, it is often the cheapest and the best way to proceed. See you tomorrow, where we'll be talking about the different levels you can go to in a language so you can work out what would be satisfying for you.